And the issue is not just heroin in deference to Mr. Dershowitz. In fact, the heroin problem is, in fact, leveling off and in some cases decreasing. The issue is drugs like cocaine and crack, specifically in New York City, that causes most crime. In the areas of New York City that have the cheapest and most available crack at $3 to $5 a vial, the crime level is the highest, which goes in direct contradiction with what Mr. Dershowitz said. And finally, of course, we know that most drug users will continue to be involved with crime even if we give them drugs. I trust none of us are so naive to believe that if we give a guy who is used to, for 2 to 3 years, banging somebody over the head for $200 a day for drugs, if we give him his drugs, he's then going to go to work for $150 a week. We're not that naive, are we? And finally, I will tell you, I have been in this business for 23 years, and the only addiction I have seen, the addiction that's stronger than the addiction to crack, is the addiction to quick and easy money. And that will continue by drug users, even if you give them drugs. What we must do is do away with the demand and do away with the supply.
You and Congressman Rangel have raised some extraordinarily interesting questions. We have yet to hear from Hugh Downs. We have yet to hear from Dr. Jerome Jaffe, and we're going to do that and a couple of other things when we come back in just a moment.
On a DEA undercover videotape, an informant, 2 corrupt Miami police officers, and a school security guard plan a drug deal.
How much stuff does she have? 2, 3 kilos? Yeah. Well, so you're talking 30 kilos at 30,000. That's named.
One of the high prices of the illegal drug trade is a staggering amount of official corruption throughout the United States. Sergeant Pat Moyer of the U.S. Park Police in Washington, D.C.
I'd be naive to say that there wouldn't be somebody on my department that might not be involved in the drug business or giving information.
Authorities blame the estimated $60 to $140 billion drug economy. Even those who oppose legalization concede it's the illegal nature of the drug trade that generates most of the money that corrupts the officials. Richard Gregory of the Miami U.S. Attorney's Office.
They become corrupt because, as with all other criminals, they're greedy, and the narcotics trade is bringing in tremendous amounts of money.
In recent years, major drug corruption scandals have broken out in Miami, Brooklyn, even in tiny Kermit, West Virginia, where police and other officials ran a drug house right next to City Hall. Mark Schnapp, chief of the criminal division of the Miami U.S. Attorney's Office, says drug corruption no longer just involves an officer taking a bribe to look the other way.
We see the cop as the dope. We see the cop ripping off hundreds of kilos of cocaine. We see the cop, the public official that the citizen in the street has the most daily contact with, is the doper.
But not all the corruption involves public officials. Lawyers, bankers, accountants, businessmen, and many others have also succumbed as the traffickers spread their wealth throughout society. Authorities say drug dealers are buying up apartment complexes, mansions, fancy cars, jewelry, ranches, even a recording studio. By investing their money in legitimate businesses, even though laws try to prevent it, traffickers hide their money and strengthen their operations. Supporters believe legalization would rob the traffickers of most of their profits and help topple their organizations. Under this theory, it would also loosen their stranglehold on public officials and legitimate business. Mark Potter, ABC News, Miami.
This ABC News special, a national town meeting, the legalization of drugs, will continue in a moment.
Organized crime in the United States made $27.5 billion from the sale of narcotics. That's more than the combined profits of IBM, Exxon, Ford, General Motors, General Electric, AT&T, Philip Morris, and DuPont.
One argument for the legalization of drugs is that it would save hundreds of millions of dollars in enforcement costs. 2 of our affiliated stations have examined different aspects of that story for us. First, Scott Pelley of WFAA in Dallas. Here now is that report.
Go on with that APU, Cap.
In the Arizona desert, $17 million is pulled from thin air. This is Aerostat, a new radar balloon seeking airborne drug smugglers. The multi-million-dollar investment on this site is just the beginning. Customs is planning on building 5 more of these all along the southwest border. It is an excellent example of the new high-tech, high-dollar weaponry being used in the war on drugs, a war whose costs are going literally sky high. The arsenal now includes pursuit jets, AWACS radar planes, and military helicopters. Federal cost this year, $3 billion. Local police will spend more. In Dallas and other cities, heavily armed assault teams now attack drug houses. Costs for equipment and training are soaring. This year, Dallas alone will spend more than $2 million. Nationally, enforcement costs almost $8 billion a year. If drugs were legalized, some estimate taxpayers would save 75% of that. Consider, $8 billion covers most of NASA's budget, or would cut individual federal income tax about 2%. But for now, the drug war has become an arms race with a rapidly rising tax burden. This is Scott Pelley reporting from Fort Huachuca, Arizona.
This is Peggy Lewis in Miami, where drug arrests and seizures occur almost daily in an area considered the gateway for cocaine to the rest of the nation. And the costs of the drug war move into the courts. Dexter Leighton is the U.S. Attorney for South Florida.
In this district, the majority of the criminal trials are drug trials, and the majority of all criminal cases are drug cases, and the majority of the prosecutors are working in drug matters one way or another.
The National Drug Enforcement Policy Board estimates the cost to the federal government to prosecute drug cases has gone from $44.5 million 7 years ago to $142 million today. The nation's judicial system is spending some $2 billion to prosecute and incarcerate people involved in drug-related crimes. And it's only expected to get worse as the number of crimes increase and sentences get longer. Already nationally, about 10% of the 500,000 state prison inmates are there because they violated drug laws and make up about 1/3 of the 44,000 federal prisoners. With prison and court costs expected to go even higher, those in favor of legalization argue it will cut these costs and reduce prison populations. This is Peggy Lewis in Miami.
And now we're going to be joined by an old friend and colleague of mine, the co-host of ABC's 2020, and I was interested to discover, Hugh and I talked about this on the phone the other day, for some 20-odd years you have been mulling over this problem of legalization and have come to what conclusions? And put that in context, would you?
Yeah, 20 years ago, it was just about exactly 20 years ago on the Today Show on NBC, I first explored the idea of considering both decriminalization, and I use the word legalization, of marijuana in that case. It was extremely unpopular as a view, and the roof fell in on me. But since then, in radio commentaries and twice on 2020, I've said I thought we really ought to seriously consider legalization. And I found a remarkable change in public attitudes in that 20 years. I think the public is ahead of the politicians on this one.
It's only half the roof that's going to collapse on you this time.
Less than half, a little bit the last time. Two points that I'd like to make. I have not heard opponents yet of legalization call for a return to prohibition. And one of the things that hasn't been really cited yet is the heavy total social cost of prohibition. Granted, fewer people drank then, but there were people drinking methyl alcohol instead of ethyl, going blind and dying. The rise of the rum runners and the Torrio gang and the Capone gang, who controlled whole governments in the Midwest. I see a possibility. This may sound a little paranoid. If we continue to dig the same hole deeper, the Medellin cartel, for example, which already controls governments in the southern hemisphere, it's not inconceivable that that kind of lobby money and pressure could come to a man in Congress who was saying, ready to put forth a bill to legalize drugs, and say to him, we have the money to fund your opponent, and next term you won't be here in the Congress, and we can fund his campaign if you don't back down. Now, I'm not saying this is happening, but it's not inconceivable if we continue along the same course we've been going, along with the tremendous crime.
Two issues that Mr. Downs, with all due respect, he said the American public has turned around. That's clearly not true. Your own numbers show that about 90% are against legalization today, which is more than we're against legalization.
No, I'm just saying there was a change in the response to me from when I first did it. So
but there are still more people against legalization today than a dozen years ago. That is simply not true.
May I interrupt you for just 1 second? Because those figures have not been broken down quite the way that they do. When you just isolate marijuana, for example, you'll find that roughly 25% of the American public are now in favor of legalization of marijuana. Separate that from
but
the
we're
other
not
drugs.
talking about just marijuana.
Well,
we're talking about drugs.
I understand. Mr. Mayor?
I believe that the reason that we have failed to control the situation is that we are not committed to everything that it takes by way of law enforcement. Japan ended drug addiction. Theirs was amphetamines. And they ended it with very stringent law enforcement. They don't have that problem. We're not willing to commit those resources. When you say $8 billion is spent on law enforcement, we would save 75%. I'd rather spend $16 billion, double it, and eliminate the drug trade rather than to save the 70%.
How?
I'll tell you how, in my judgment. The reason that people continue to use drugs is they're not punished. I'm talking about the drug user as well as the drug pusher. Now, everybody says, oh, remember the Rockefeller days when he wanted to send everybody away for life imprisonment and juries wouldn't do it. So don't send them away for life imprisonment. How about a couple of months? How about work farms? How about making someone pay a penalty? Today, you do not pay a penalty. Now, Dr. Jaffe said something to me, and I said, why don't you say it? And he said, no, I'm a doctor, not a lawyer, so I will say it.
Well, where's it? Poor Dr. Jaffe hasn't had a chance to say anything yet.
Why don't you say it?
Let me just
I thought it was absolutely correct.
Dr. Jaffe is director of the Addiction Research Center of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, a part of the U.S. Public Health Service, and has been very quiet, and I apologize for not coming to you sooner. What was it that you said to the mayor?
I'm not sure what I said to the mayor.
On our unwillingness to apply law enforcement and all of the protections that we have built, so it becomes impossible to convict somebody. It becomes impossible to convict somebody without spending $70,000. That's ridiculous what we've done to ourselves.
That's a great statement, Dr. Jaffe.
And you said it so well, too. Go ahead, Dr. Jaffe, I'm sorry.
Well, I think the mayor is right that the user is the key to demand. And that at some point, there's an inconsistency in saying a law-abiding citizen who only uses an illicit drug, even the single act of using occasionally, contributes to this thing that we call the drug problem. And at some point, the penalties do not have to be draconian. But the probability has to be high enough to impress people with the likelihood that there will be an adverse effect.
Like parking
like a parking ticket when the people are doing their job. But there are ways to do this. We're doing it now, and we did it once when we faced a situation. It was a number of years ago, but I think Chairman Rangel, Mayor Koch they were in Congress at the time. But we did have a situation in which we couldn't control the flow of heroin into Vietnam. And at that point, it looked almost hopeless. Nobody said, let's legalize it and tell the Viet Cong to bring in more. It was a catastrophe. And the real issue was, how do you create a situation in which you change the attitude of the users? They happened to be armed with M16s at the time. The point was that we instituted a situation in which the penalties weren't draconian, but we tested. We found when there was drug use that people went into a program.
Let me just turn to one of our lawyers.
And it had an impact.
Alan,
it reduced the...
I'd like to know how you punish a homeless addict, how you punish a jobless addict that's out there in the street to teach him a lesson for abusing drugs.
I'll tell you one thing you could do, Charlie, and that is you can take him out of the environment, as the mayor suggests, and have work camps that may be punishment to some people, but have treatment facilities, are separate from the environment in which he was committed the crime.
Would you settle for homes and jobs, maybe, as an initial step?
May I just...
Could you start with that?
Gentlemen,
trying to see what makes people jobs.
For the sake... Hold it, Mr. Mayor. For the sake of our radio audience, let me at least identify the combatants here. The last voice you heard was that of Mayor Ed Koch, William Von Rabb, and Charles Rangel. Now, go ahead, Mayor Koch.
Very briefly, Homes and Jobs will not do it. When Dr. Thornton talked about the community, I didn't want to get involved in saying, listen, that's 60 rhetoric. It is not a question of the community. It is a question of sanctions. It is a question of paying a penalty. Rich people are on drugs. They have homes and jobs. The fact is that people take drugs not because they're poor.
Ed, I'm asking, how do you punish the tens of thousands? Let me finish, please. Sure. I'm not Dr. Jaffe. Listen, how do you punish the tens of thousands of homeless people that are sleeping in the street and they're on drugs, and you go up to them and say, I'm the chief executive officer of the city of New York. I want to teach you a lesson.
I will tell you how you do
the law. Tell me what you do.
You give sentences of 30 days or 60 days.
They want it.
No, they don't want it. Oh, come on. They do not want to go to work camps.
Do you know what will happen to the prison population of this country?
Alan Dershowitz.
Do you know what will happen to the
Hold on just a second. Alan Dershowitz, then we got to go to a break, and we'll come back to you, Ms. Thornton, and Dr. Thornton.
We will have 10 million people in jail.
Alan, how did Japan do it?
Japan is a law-abiding country which doesn't have the guts to have an immigration policy that is like ours, which didn't have a problem of slavery, which didn't have the social ills we have. Don't make comparisons. If you want to start putting casual users in jail, we're going to have more jails than we're going to have law offices and business offices and politicians.
I don't believe it. The penalty will depend upon how casual.
Do you know what happens to the civil liberties in a society when you start making criminals? That's right, I care about civil liberties.
I do too.
I care about
the civil liberties of society.
And
so
so do I.
Well, I'm not so sure, Alan.
I want to stop the victimization of innocent people who have not chosen to use drugs.
Drug users
and the answer
are
is not to put
victims.
people in jail.
They are abusers.
Reverend Jackson, thank you very much. You're the only man on this panel who could have done that. We have to take a break, but we'll be back in just a moment.
The legalization of drugs continues in a moment.
Cocaine, known as coke, is a drug extracted from the leaves of the coca plant. The drug, a white powder, is usually snorted, but it is also smoked, a technique known as freebasing, and it can be injected. Crack is cocaine, which has been chemically altered so it can be easily smoked. Cocaine seems to stimulate electrical activity in an area of the brain associated with pleasure. The cocaine high, or rush, produces a sense of euphoria, energy, and alertness. The high is immediate, but disappears within an hour and may be followed by a crash involving depression, fatigue, and tension. Cocaine causes the blood vessels to narrow, making the heart beat faster and work harder. Uncommonly, but unpredictably, cocaine causes an irregular heartbeat and can trigger sudden heart attacks, even in common doses in users with apparently healthy hearts. Chronic use can cause insomnia, brain seizures, strokes, and severe paranoia. Cocaine does not produce physical dependence with withdrawal symptoms, but it can cause severe psychological cravings. Crack produces the most dramatic cocaine high since the drug reaches the brain almost instantly. It is therefore highly addictive.
Just a few minutes ago, Mayor Koch made reference to the sort of drug culture of the 1960s. Many Americans consider the 60s, in fact, the heyday of drug use and drug abuse in this country. But what did the heroes of the counterculture then think about what's happening now? Here's that report.
Coming into Los Angeles, bringing in a couple of keys.
The whole world of what I call the cultural revolution that happened here in this country was partially dependent upon seeing things from another point of view, and drugs induce those other points of view. I say, if you're going to do it, and you can't ban it, let's legalize it, and keep the same people who are doing it. Give them a legitimate job. Tax them. Make some money from it.
I mean, we really believed that marijuana was going to transform America. We felt if Richard Nixon would only get stoned on marijuana, he'd immediately make a phone call and bring all the troops back from Vietnam. Marijuana and heroin and cocaine are destroying the youth of America today. And the only way I legalize it is if every single penny was spent on a nonstop educational campaign on television to get people not to do drugs.
The entire narcotics business
He has always been corrupt and always been in cahoots with organized crime, and there has never been a real war on drugs. And the only way you get a war on drugs is if you actually legalize them. That would collapse the entire economic nexus, which is the center of it.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome with us Crosby, Still,
If they told us it would lead to harder stuff, and we all said, no way. You know, not a chance. You know, I'm not going to do that stuff. And I did. It did do that to a lot of us. I couldn't bring myself to say, no, go ahead and legalize it, because I don't want, as a matter of fact, I more than don't want, I would be raging mad at anybody that wanted to make it possible for my 12-year-old, 13-year-old daughter to go down and buy heroin at the drugstore.
They died because it was illegal. They died because they didn't know what they were getting. I think we should legalize certain drugs, and I would legalize heroin, I would legalize cocaine, but not crack, and I would certainly legalize marijuana, because failing to legalize them, particularly heroin, has made a lot of people on the streets into animals.
Before we get into the debate of legal or illegal, we should increase the education. Because once you legalize it, you're not going to solve the problem. Our body's going to get immune to it.
Go back to the laboratories and give us a psychedelic drug that doesn't have any negative side effects.
If and when, and it will happen very soon, the younger generation coming into power decriminalizes cocaine, makes it a prescription drug with the licensing and protections and labels on the package and instruction manuals as to how not to abuse it, the abuse will go way down, and in one day, the criminal apparatus and empire will stop.
We don't have to do it forever, you know, just try it, see what happens.
All right, some voices from the past and the present. Sir, you have a question or a comment from Mayor Concha.
Yes, I'm a product of New York. I was born and raised in the Bronx. I'm an ex-con. I did time for the state of New York, 1983. I've been to just about every secular program you have here, drug program, methadone maintenance programs. They didn't seem to work, Mr. Mayor. A lot of these mental health so-called programs didn't work. My urge to use drugs got bigger and bigger, such as in the methadone case, where I strayed to cocaine. As far as prison is concerned, I went in and out of prisons. I never really got rehabilitated, quote unquote. The first day I would get out of prisons, I'd go back to my heroin and cocaine use. Right now I'm at Transformation Life Center. I'm going to tell you what worked for me. God, Jesus Christ, worked in my life and changed my life. I have to praise God that I'm standing here alive today. Number one, I'd like to see more of the church in the cities get involved with this drug problem, the community itself. It's a personal thing. It starts at the family level in our communities. Number two, I'm going to approach you with this question because it wasn't too long ago that I was at what you call a shooting gallery. And I had sought help to one of your city programs, drug programs. I don't want to call a name. And there's a long list, a long waiting list for many people that need help out there that can't get into drug programs. People don't have Medicaids. I myself don't have Medicaids. It took a church, Manhattan Bible Church, to take me in off the streets. I appreciate that. My question is, where all these answers, where's all this money going to? I mean, where the rubber meets the road, that's what I would like to know, how we can help
I'll tell you
people. You know, I mean, I see a lot of people here very stagnant, very comfortable, but we really have to reach out to a lot of people, you know, be personally involved. As far as the legalization is concerned, I think that's totally wrong. I mean, I wouldn't like my son or my daughter to get drug addicted because of the government making it easy. These are things that we all have to come to an agreement with, and it's really affected my family, and I praise the Lord that I'm here speaking to you right now.
You raised a question of Mayor Koch.
Very simply,
treatment centers.
The city of New York does not provide or fund for treatment centers. We do the law enforcement, and the state has the obligation of providing treatment centers. Regrettably, they have not provided the numbers needed, only 35,000 addicts, and there are 200,000 heroin addicts in the city. Only 35,000 are in treatment.
Capital of the
Now,
world.
the federal government, since it is responsible for allowing cocaine and heroin to come into the country, cannot be grown in Central Park, they should be providing treatment on demand. Some folks would say, well, why doesn't the city do it? Because if the city did it, then we wouldn't have money for all of our other services. We don't ask the state or the federal government to provide the more than $1 billion that we're spending on cops and our more than $2 billion on health and hospital services. And so we, the city, cannot take on that obligation. But you're absolutely right. There should be treatment on demand. I'm for that. Now, when you said that everything else didn't work for you, but religion did, that's terrific. That's absolutely, that's like Alcoholics Anonymous is a form of religion. You went directly to the church.
All right,
when did the city stop doing drug rehab?
In 1979, the state took over that obligation.
I know, but still, the city always had drug rehabilitation programs.
In 1979, the city used to also pay for the subway system, Charlie, and the city used to pay for CUNY University. Those obligations were taken over by the state.
I know, but the way you said it, as though we were banned that the state, that we take care of the police.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
But if we wanted, we could provide.
Well, then you'd have to provide.
Though.
Then you would have.
No, I'm just wondering.
There's a limited pot of money.
From providing
Charlie,
it,
there's a limited pot of money. And if you say that we have to spend the money on drug treatment and it isn't the state or the federal government, then we will spend less in other areas.
Mr. Mayor, forgive me. I want to try and move this thing around a little bit. Dr. Shirley Thornton first, and Jesse Jackson.
I want to get back to a statement you made earlier, Dr. Koch. You said it's, Mayor, that you mentioned the whole topic about the 60s and the rhetoric of the 60s. Right. I'm sorry that you believe communities working in concert with agencies cannot solve their problems. I'm not talking about having people come in and bring money and take away programs as they begin to work. I am saying that agencies within communities have to come together, hopefully with a mayor in charge, working with other department heads and community-based organizations and churches and everything else that is said to address the schools and all those issues.
You were saying that the answer is to be found in the community. That
is exactly what I am saying that communities, when empowered to make differences in their lives, that means schools.
That's rhetoric.
That means schools that are working. That means communities. I drove through this city today, and there was enough work with Phil to put a whole lot of people to work if we wanted to give jobs.
Well, I understand that. The fact is, just so you'll know, there isn't a single person in this city who can't get a job if they want a job at even above minimum wage. Many people do not want to take jobs. So you should know that.
Well, then the next thing, I will personally bring you a book that deals with culture and drugs to look at maybe the misalignment of culture has become the problems with where we're going today.
Dr. Thornton, let me go to Mr. Jackson again.
Personally bring you a book that deals with culture and drugs to look at maybe the misalignment of culture has become the problems with where we're going today.
Dr. Thornton, let me go to Mr. Jackson again, and we're going to go ahead.
A couple of instances, the matter of religion has come up. Beside the issue of the supply of drugs and the demand for drugs is the deeper issue of the craving. What is it that drugs are trying to satisfy? What gap in our meaning are they addressing? In other words, is some combination of mindless materialism for some people and abounding poverty and hopelessness for others are being addressed with drugs as an anesthesia for their pain? Because if we try to isolate the addicted community to a certain group of quote-unquote junkies who have a certain kind of profile, it may miss my experience. I visited, as you know, about 4 elementary or high schools a week from September to June. And quickly I asked those children, usually 3,000 to 5,000, suburb, inner city, how many of you know someone in your classroom, in your school, your class age, who's dead because of drugs? Usually about 25% stand. You know someone in your age group who is in jail because of drugs? usually about 60% stand. You notice when your age group who has tried drugs, usually about 90% stand, from Pasadena to Seattle, Washington, all across the country. And lastly, you know someone was contemplating suicide. Never fewer than 60% of our children stand. So quite a problem. Money.